Part 3. Those were happy days, which appeared to me almost as a dream, but they were bound to remain only a dream. 2 years later, my mother's death put a brutal end to all my fine projects. She succumbed to a long and painful illness which from the very beginning permitted little hope of recovery. Though expected, her death came as a terrible blow to me. I respected my father, but I loved my mother. Poverty and stern reality forced me to decide promptly. The meager resources of the family had been almost entirely used up through my mother's severe illness. The allowance which came to me as an orphan was not enough for the bare necessities of life. Somehow or other I would have to earn my own bread. With my clothes and linen packed in a valise and with an indomitable resolution in my heart, I left for Vienna. I hoped to forestall fate, as my father had done 50 years before. I was determined to become something, but certainly not a civil servant. Note 1. In order to understand the reference here, and similar references in later portions of Mein Kampf, the following must be borne in mind. From 1792 to 1814 the French revolutionary armies overran Germany. In 1800 Bavaria shared in the Austrian defeat at Hohenlinden and the French-occupied Munich. In 1805 the Bavarian elector was made King of Bavaria by Napoleon and stipulated to back up Napoleon in all his wars with a force of 30,000 men. Thus Bavaria became the absolute vassal of the French. This was the time of Germany's deepest humiliation, which is referred to again and again by Hitler. In 1806 a pamphlet entitled, Germany's Deepest Humiliation, was published in South Germany. Among those who helped to circulate the pamphlet was the Nuremberg bookseller, Johannes Philipp Palm. He was denounced to the French by a Bavarian police agent. At his trial he refused to disclose the name of the author. By Napoleon's orders, he was shot at Braunau on the Inn on August 26, 1806. A monument erected to him on the site of the execution was one of the first public objects that made an impression on Hitler as a little boy. Leo Schlechter's case was in many respects parallel to that of Johannes Palm. Schlechter was a German theological student who volunteered for service in 1914. He became an artillery officer and won the Iron Cross of both classes. When the French occupied the Ruhr in 1923, Schlechter helped to organize the passive resistance on the German side. He and his companions blew up a railway bridge for the purpose of making the transport of coal to France more difficult. Those who took part in the affair were denounced to the French by a German informer. Schlechter took the whole responsibility on his own shoulders and was condemned to death, his companions being sentenced to various terms of imprisonment and penal servitude by the French court. Schlechter refused to disclose the identity of those who issued the order to blow up the railway bridge, and he would not plead for mercy before a French court. He was shot by a French firing squad on May 26, 1923. Severing was at that time German Minister of the Interior. It is said that representations were made to him in Schlechter's behalf and that he refused to interfere. Schlechter has become the chief martyr of the German resistance to the French occupation of the Ruhr and also one of the great heroes of the National Socialist movement. He had joined the movement at a very early stage, his card of membership bearing the number 61. Note 2. Non-classical secondary school. The Lyceum and Gymnasium were classical or semi-classical secondary schools. Note 3. See Translator's Introduction. Note 4. When Francis II had laid down his title as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which he did at the command of Napoleon, the crown and mace, as the imperial insignia, were kept in Vienna. After the German Empire was refounded, in 1871, under William I, there were many demands to have the insignia transferred to Berlin. But these went unheeded. Hitler had them brought to Germany after the Austrian Anschluss and displayed at Nuremberg during the Party Congress in September 1938. Years of study and suffering in Vienna. When my mother died, my fate had already been decided in one respect. During the last months of her illness, I went to Vienna to take the entrance examination for the Academy of Fine Arts. Armed with a bulky packet of sketches, I felt convinced that I should pass the examination quite easily. At the REALSCHULE, I was by far the best student in the drawing class, and since that time I had made more than ordinary progress in the practice of drawing. Therefore I was pleased with myself and was proud and happy at the prospect of what I considered an assured success. But there was one misgiving. It seemed to me that I was better qualified for drawing than for painting, especially in the various branches of architectural drawing. At the same time, my interest in architecture was constantly increasing. And I advanced in this direction at a still more rapid pace after my first visit to Vienna, which lasted 2 weeks. I was not yet 16 years old. I went to the Hof Museum to study the paintings in the art gallery there, but the building itself captured almost all my interest. From early morning until late at night I spent all my time visiting the various public buildings. And it was the buildings themselves that were always the principal attraction for me. For hours and hours I could stand in wonderment before the opera and the parliament. The whole Ringstrasse had a magic effect upon me, as if it were a scene from the 1001 Nights. And now I was here for the second time in this beautiful city, impatiently waiting to hear the result of the entrance examination, but proudly confident that I had got through. I was so convinced of my success that when the news that I had failed to pass was brought to me, it struck me like a bolt from the skies. Yet the fact was that I had failed. I went to see the rector and asked him to explain the reasons why they refused to accept me as a student in the General School of Painting, which was part of the academy. He said that the sketches which I had brought with me unquestionably showed that painting was not what I was suited for, but that the same sketches gave clear indications of my aptitude for architectural designing. Therefore the school of painting did not come into question for me, but rather the school of architecture, which also formed part of the academy. At first it was impossible to understand how this could be so, seeing that I had never been to a school for architecture and had never received any instruction in architectural designing. When I left the Hansen Palace, on the Schillerplatz, I was quite crestfallen. I felt out of sorts with myself for the first time in my young life. For what I had heard about my capabilities now appeared to me as a lightning flash, which clearly revealed a dualism under which I had been suffering for a long time, but hitherto I could give no clear account whatsoever of the why and wherefore. Within a few days I myself also knew that I ought to become an architect. But of course the way was very difficult. I was now forced bitterly to rue my former conduct in neglecting and despising certain subjects at the REALSCHULE. Before taking up the courses at the School of Architecture in the Academy, it was necessary to attend the Technical Building School, but a necessary qualification for entrance into this school was a leaving certificate from the middle school. And this I simply did not have. According to the human measure of things, my dream of following an artistic calling seemed beyond the limits of possibility. After the death of my mother, I came to Vienna for the third time. This visit was destined to last several years. Since I had been there before, I had recovered my old calm and resoluteness. The former self-assurance had come back, and I had my eyes steadily fixed on the goal. I would be an architect. Obstacles are placed across our path in life, not to be boggled at but to be surmounted. And I was fully determined to surmount these obstacles, having the picture of my father constantly before my mind, who had raised himself by his own efforts to the position of a civil servant, though he was the poor son of a village shoemaker. I had a better start, and the possibilities of struggling through were better. At that time my lot in life seemed to me a harsh one, but today I see in it the wise workings of Providence. The goddess of fate clutched me in her hands and often threatened to smash me, but the will grew stronger as the obstacles increased, and finally the will triumphed. I am thankful for that period of my life, because it hardened me and enabled me to be as tough as I now am. And I am even more thankful because I appreciate the fact that I was thus saved from the emptiness of a life of ease, and that a mother's darling was taken from tender arms and handed over to adversity as to a new mother. Though I then rebelled against it as too hard a fate, I am grateful that I was thrown into a world of misery and poverty, and thus came to know the people for whom I was afterwards to fight. It was during this period that my eyes were opened to two perils, the names of which I scarcely knew hitherto, and had no notion whatsoever of their terrible significance for the existence of the German people. These two perils were Marxism and Judaism. For many people, the name of Vienna signifies innocent jollity, a festive place for happy mortals. For me, alas, it is a living memory of the saddest period in my life. Even today the mention of that city arouses only gloomy thoughts in my mind. 5 years of poverty in that Fischen, note 5 town. 5 years in which, first as a casual laborer and then as a painter of little trifles, I had to earn my daily bread. And a meager morsel indeed it was, not even sufficient to still the hunger which I constantly felt. That hunger was the faithful guardian which never left me but took part in everything I did. Every book that I bought meant renewed hunger, and every visit I paid to the opera meant the intrusion of that inalienable companion during the following days. I was always struggling with my unsympathetic friend. And yet during that time I learned more than I had ever learned before. Outside my architectural studies and rare visits to the opera, for which I had to deny myself food, I had no other pleasure in life except my books. I read a great deal then, and I pondered deeply over what I read. All the free time after work was devoted exclusively to study. Thus within a few years I was able to acquire a stock of knowledge which I find useful even today. But more than that, during those years a view of life and a definite outlook on the world took shape in my mind. These became the granite basis of my conduct at that time. Since then I have extended that foundation only very little, and I have changed nothing in it. On the contrary, I am firmly convinced today that, generally speaking, it is in youth that men lay the essential groundwork of their creative thought, wherever that creative thought exists. I make a distinction between the wisdom of age which can only arise from the greater profundity and foresight that are based on the experiences of a long life, and the creative genius of youth, which blossoms out in thought and ideas with inexhaustible fertility, without being able to put these into practice immediately, because of their very superabundance. These furnish the building materials and plans for the future, and it is from them that age takes the stones and builds the edifice, unless the so-called wisdom of the years may have smothered the creative genius of youth. The life which I had hitherto led at home with my parents differed in little or nothing from that of all the others. I looked forward without apprehension to the morrow, and there was no such thing as a social problem to be faced. Those among whom I passed my young days belonged to the small bourgeois class. Therefore it was a world that had very little contact with the world of genuine manual laborers. For, though at first this may appear astonishing, the ditch which separates that class, which is by no means economically well off, from the manual laboring class is often deeper than people think. The reason for this division, which we may almost call enmity, lies in the fear that dominates a social group which has only just risen above the level of the manual laborer, a fear lest it may fall back into its old condition or at least be classed with the laborers. Moreover, there is something repulsive in remembering the cultural indigence of that lower class and their rough manners with one another. So that people who are only on the first rung of the social ladder find it unbearable to be forced to have any contact with the cultural level and standard of living out of which they have passed. Part 4 will be continued.